The first is, of course, that she is accusing two nations of almost exactly what her own nation is doing, which is, clever agitprop, but hardly what you would refer to as straightforward truth telling. But let's pick apart some of those comments. Last time I looked at the data, there were in excess of 100,000 Russian troops and tanks and other forms of mechanized warfare surrounding Ukraine on three sides. There was a major military exercise with Russia's one ally in the region, Belarus, on the northern edge of Ukraine. There was a Russian flotilla of somewhere around 30 naval ships in the Black Sea, poised to presumably or potentially attack southern ports and regions in Ukraine. And by the way, those military exercises that the West was purportedly having in Ukraine, there were about 150 trainers, that is, people instructing in the use of defensive weapons like anti-tank missiles, and they're gone. They packed up and they left. And as best I can tell, and I haven't done a thorough search of it in the 10 seconds that I had, there were no U.S. military exercises in Ukraine at all. There are, in fact, American troops, not many, a couple thousand, in a number of neighboring NATO member nations, but that hardly is equivalent to a massive military force surrounding Ukraine that is Russian in its nature. And we haven't even bothered to mention at this point the forcible seizure of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 and a 10-year campaign on the eastern side of Ukraine for a separatist group that is supplied and supported by the Russians over the last decade, as well as any number of comments about the so-called purported neo-fascist state that runs Ukraine, that comes out of a variety of Russian news and semi-news sources. All things considered, I think you have to take what your Russian journalist, we use that term loosely, I guess, said, because there's no fact-based information there. Let's be absolutely clear about this. The Ukrainian government is not a threat to the Russians. The Russians happen to be about 6 times as large in population, 5 or 6 times as large in economic heft, and orders of magnitude larger in military capabilities. It would be an act of insanity for the Ukrainian government to incite the Russians to attack it. What we do have, however, is an effort by the Russian government and its head, Vladimir Putin, to argue that any effort by the Ukrainian government to move further and further away emotionally and in policy terms from its former subservience to the old Soviet Union is tantamount to an incitement against Russia. I mean, and that boggles my mind. This whole episode is something that doesn't have to happen, dependent on what goes on in the Russian leader's mind. If he chooses not to attack, whether it's on Wednesday or next week or a month from now, doesn't really matter very much. I mean, that date of Wednesday seems a bit arbitrary, but who knows? If he chooses not to do that, this whole crisis begins to melt away, just like the spring thaw. And that's a nice analogy, even if the spring thaw will be a couple of months from now. There has been a whole range of delegations from various Western nations phone calls, public statements, effectively imploring the Russians not to tighten the tension further, but to move forward into the channel of diplomacy. But the sticking point for the Russians, as best I understand it, is that they insist that Ukraine never, ever, ever, that's a long time, join NATO, which they haven't applied to and haven't been asked to, and that the West, and especially the United States, begin to draw its whatever forces are in countries like Poland or the Baltic republics, begin to draw them down. And they're in the grand scheme of things, those are very small forces. They're several thousands of military, as opposed to what is approximately a quarter of the entire Russian army now surrounding Ukraine. So I enjoyed your Russian correspondent's comments, but I think she needs to look in a mirror.
Okay, let's then understand. We do know that the Ukraine doesn't stand a chance at all against a possible or an imminent invasion by Russia. They don't have the military might to stand up to Russia. So, what is this all about? Is it about the NATO membership? Is it about Nord Stream 2? We do also know that the German Chancellor has been trying to talk with both the Ukraine leadership and the Russian leadership. Is that part of the problem here as well? So, what exactly is going on? How would the NATO membership change dynamics in that part of the world? Does this then take us way back to the 1800s and the Crimean War? Are there unanswered questions from way back in history? So let's try and understand, why is Russia, with all of its might, wanting to go to war with the Ukraine?
Well, I think let's be clear. Let me give you an analogy. Do you know anything about skiing, the sport of downhill skiing? And you have to have your center of gravity, your center of balance at a certain point. Otherwise, you fall over and you roll down the hill, in a large bundle, and it's awkward and unpleasant, and you break your arms and legs. My argument now is that I think that Vladimir Putin has gotten himself just a little bit too far ahead of his skis. He's out in front of the skis a bit. I think originally the plan was to pressure Ukraine into forswearing the possibility of applying to NATO. Now, remember, there was no promise of membership, there was no invitation to join, and there really wasn't a realistic expectation on the part of Ukrainian leaders that they would become members. But the Russian plan, as I understand it, would be to have made the Ukrainians forswear any possibility of becoming members. Second part of the plan, to gain from the Americans and others concessions that any troops, any equipment, any facilities stationed in Eastern Europe would be drawn down. And in the process of these things, redrawing the strategic balance and the map of Europe that has been at peace basically since the end of the Cold War. And I do point out that at no point during the Cold War, cold because it wasn't hot, there was never any direct confrontation militarily, hostilities, that is, between the United States and the old Soviet Union. As to the historical origins of this, it goes back much further. The Crimean War doesn't really figure into this. It goes back much further to the idea that the entire soul and concept of Russia is bound up with what historically in the, 1200 years ago, Kiev in Rus, which was the state that founded the idea of Russia, is somehow a logical extension into the present of a nation that includes Ukraine, that includes the Russians, as a collective cultural, political, intellectual, social entity. But I think the argument needs to be made here by virtue of these threats from Russia. The Ukrainian national identity has become increasingly solidified and strong. And there are statements all over the place now by ordinary Ukrainians, whether they're Russian speaking or Ukrainian speaking or a mix of both, or even other languages, and there are a few in that territory as well, that they are Ukrainian by nationality, and that they will resist, by whatever means they have, obviously, any attempt at an actual military conquest. That goes back to my point about being a bit over in front of your skis. It is not an easy thing to do to subdue a nation of 40 million people who feel rather increasingly strongly that theirs is a fight against a conqueror. What it does not mean is that society wins. It does not mean that the conquered nation succeeds, but it means that the conquering nation has cut itself a task that it may not be able to achieve fully. We only have to look at fairly recent history, and I point you in the direction of a country called Afghanistan. Over a 12-year period, the Soviet Union tried militarily to control Afghanistan and failed miserably after 15,000 fatalities among its own ranks. And in parallel to that, the United States did not fare appreciably better 10 years thereafter. It is hard to conquer countries. It is hard to hold countries. But finally, and I'll wrap this up by simply saying that what would happen would be to tear up the strategic balance and the stability of Europe as an idea by this one act of hostilities against Ukraine. If I were Vladimir Putin's advisor, I would say, call it off before it's too late.
Okay, hold. We're going to ask you just to please bear with us. We're going for an ad break. When we get back, I'd like your thoughts on Nord Stream 2 and the German connection. We're also going to be looking at issues around Putin saving face, and maybe he feels that just way too much has been said and done over the past few days. He has no option but to invade the Ukraine. Is that then a possibility? So do stand by.
All right, I'm going to have to move on.
Lebanese children do not have access to education. Amman means safety and is a school that provides formal education from kindergarten to grade 9. Africa Muslim Agency aims to provide 150 children with education that will change the trajectory of their lives and their families' lives. Fulfill your intention by fulfilling their dreams. Donate 16,000 rands per child or any amount. Go to africamuslimsagency.co.za or call us on 011-834-8685. Africa Muslims Agency, empowering, educating, inspiring.
I thought I did pretty well to dance around that.
Brooks, can you hear me?
Yeah, I was just saying to you, and I'm not sure if you were able to hear, I'm going to have to break off by 8:30. I have, among other things, I have to get dressed.
No worries, no worries. We'll just 5 minutes more. Right after this ad break, we'll wrap up with those two questions that need to be answered, if you don't mind. And possibly a third. So just stand by.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
010184 or visit our website on www.sapphireglobalfs.com. Sapphire Global is an authorized financial services provider.
Your act of love gives hope. Islamic Relief supports orphans and vulnerable children in 28 countries with food, education, and medical care. There are more than 150 million orphans in the world. You can give hope to one. Sponsor an orphan today. Go to www.islamic-relief.org.za.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media.
8:22 exactly. Welcome back, and we have a few minutes left with Brooks Spector. He is a retired U.S. diplomat now based in South Africa. Welcome back, Brooks. And the issue now is, will Putin want to save face and still go ahead? Because there's been lots and lots of talk around this invasion. And then let's also understand Nord Stream 2. Obviously, once it is fully operational, it would be serving the German people. It would be supplying energy or gas to the German people. Where and how does that issue figure in this war talk? And last but not least, if the Russian invasion does go ahead, what sort of global repercussions will we expect to see? I know this sounds really extreme, but I've actually heard people saying that this could possibly perhaps start the Third World War. Your thoughts?
Well, on your last point, it won't start World War III. It's going to start a period of, if it were to happen, it would start a period of much more hostile international relations, much more fractured international relations, and the repercussions, and this bleeds into one of your other questions, will have enormous economic impacts on a whole range of countries. Here's a lesson that I learned over the weekend. I went to a store to buy some clothing on sale because the summer sales are starting in South Africa, even though we're still in the middle of the summer. All right. And I found a pair of trousers, men's pants that I happen to like and were lightweight for the summer. And as I do, I looked inside and there was the label where it was made. And where it was made was in Ukraine under license from a German fashion designer. And what that began to tell me was that Ukraine is now rather thoroughly integrated into the world trade system, the world global supply chain. And I did a little more digging and I realized that Ukraine is now the world's fourth largest grain exporter. I knew it was fertile land, but I didn't realize that it had been exporting that much grain. But most of that grain goes to countries that are either politically or economically fragile, places like Lebanon, places like Libya, places like Indonesia, various parts of South Asia, many parts of Africa. And if Ukraine's economic circumstances were to degrade dramatically, much of the grain imports by those countries, import export, much of the grain imports by those countries would suffer. That would increase prices dramatically, and that would cause greater economic or political instability. You get your choice. Either one of them is not very nice. Already we note that the price of petroleum, crude oil, is now at I believe its 4-year high. And that has repercussions for countries that depend on imported oil. Countries, not surprisingly, that include South Africa, where you and I are based, as well as China. And the next part of that equation, it would introduce an enormous degree of volatility in international foreign exchange processes. You may think that's distant from an ordinary person's dining room table, but much of what we all buy is dependent on the ability of where we are ability to import that or sell something else. And if foreign exchange begins to be extremely volatile, that makes it yet more complicated. So supply chain problems, agricultural export problems, foreign exchange volatility. The general quality of the global economy degrades rather dramatically from this. As to the question of whether or not Russia, Vladimir Putin, is in too far not to withdraw, how to save face, well, the short answer is that Vladimir Putin can easily start to draw down the troops, saying this was all a degree of military exercise to show what they could do, and that the greater willingness, and I'm putting words in Vladimir Putin's putative mouth, you know, if you're listening, copy this down and use it. This crisis has shown the willingness of both sides to negotiate for the future of the European security architecture, and we look forward to a conference in Vienna or Geneva or Kathmandu, wherever they like, to carry this kind of conversation further. Ukrainians then get a chance to breathe and continue with everyday life, and we move on. It does put a hole in the argument of those people who say this is all a plot by the West to somehow bludgeon the poor Russians into having to accept NATO 10 miles outside of Moscow. Now, the last part that you want to talk about is Nord Stream 2, and I see you're itching to get there.
I'm itching for that, and also your indulgence for a further minute, because I have a brilliant question from a listener. Can I just give it to you, and then you can wrap up? Our listener is asking, remember back in 2017, 2018, we saw what we thought would be a war between US and North Korea. What has since happened? And also, he goes on to say, remember how Trump, I'm just trying to get the information on screen. I think I have lost it. The second part of the question. Remember how Trump used to talk bad against Kim Jong-un, and how the world waited with bated breath, thinking the two nations were going to attack each other. And finally, Trump has since become great friends with Kim. So the German and Nord Stream 2 question, and the question from our listener as well, please.
Yeah. Western Europe generally, and Germany in particular, depend a great deal on imported natural gas for heating and other fuel purposes. And Nord Stream 2 was a pipeline from Russian territory directly to terminuses in Germany, connecting up to that distribution grid in Germany for natural gas. A lot of money went into it. A lot of time has been spent building it. It is not yet operational. It is not yet, the taps are not open. What is open now is a previous pipeline that runs through Ukraine, and which fees are paid to Ukraine for the purpose of traversing that territory to distribute that natural gas onward into Western Europe. The Germans, at this point, as I understand it, are furiously looking at alternative sources of natural gas around the world, of which there is a great deal. There's no shortage of natural gas. And the trick is distribution and shipping. But the Russians quite clearly hoped that Nord Stream 2 would be a significant counter on their side, leveraging greater cooperation and support from the Germans. And so far, that has not yet materialized. It may not. And if there is, in fact, hostilities in Ukraine, you can count the number of years before Nord Stream 2 is operational on all of your fingers and all of your toes and those of your friends, because it will never happen if there are hostilities. And I think that is one of the things that is leading Vladimir Putin into rethinking somehow, some way of dialing this crisis back just a bit. And as to your listeners or your viewers' question, the North Korea American contretemps was largely a manufactured one by the personality of Donald Trump, the volatile personality of Donald Trump, and the stolid, almost unknowable personality of Kim Jong-un. And as your listener quite truly points out, they ended up exchanging what Donald Trump called, quote unquote, love letters. I've never heard of a love letter between international leaders before, but this is Donald Trump in the English language. But of course, Donald Trump isn't president now anyway, so whatever he says historically matters only to the extent that somebody may remember it. But a global crisis like this depends on people moving it forward, either toward the brink or away. And we use the term off ramps as you would on a highway. To get off the M1, you take the XYZ off ramp to get close to your house. There remain, as I said earlier in our discussion, off ramps. Most of those off ramps are in the hands of Vladimir Putin. And the problem, again, the fundamental problem is that although we know his capabilities now by virtue of the 100,000 plus military, the tanks, the missiles, the ships, whatever, surrounding Ukraine, we don't know precisely his intentions. And he has been noticeably quiet about his intentions, almost as if to say, in my mind at least, he hasn't made up his mind whether the costs outweigh the potential benefits. And as I see it, the benefits to attacking Ukraine are pretty small relative to the costs.
Okay, Brooke, let's leave it there. I do know that you need to be on your way as well, but thank you indeed for your deep insights. To the listener who has become a part of this conversation, thank you indeed for your comments and your questions. And yes, thank you indeed. You are commending Salam Media for being so advanced. We can't do it without you, so keep becoming a part of the conversation. 8:34 exactly, news and views right here on Salam Media.